Well, we're blessed to have the dulcet tones of Andrew Whitelaw back with us on Flow FM. Andrew, it's been too long.
Thanks, Ricky. It's probably been January, I reckon.
Look, I don't know, but it's good to have you back with us, and we are now well and truly into that part of the year where farmers are getting ready or getting stuff into the soil. What are you picking up around the traps where the planting intentions are at the moment?
Look, from still the early days, I think people are still deciding, but from what I'm hearing, a bit more barley and a bit less canola. I think people are still relatively confident. It's looking like it's going to be drier than last year, and the year before, but those were both monumentally moist years. But I think a few moves are probably attractive to farmers at the moment. If we look at fertiliser prices, they're starting to slide. Diesel prices are starting to slide a bit. So that's some of the major costs that farmers are facing. That alleviates some of that cost price squeeze we've seen over the past probably 2 years now. So that's hopefully going to lead to, at least if they don't produce a massive crop, their cost of producing that crop will be lower this year.
Now, far be it from me to be a weather agency, but one source I rely on indicates we're heading for a wet week coming up, and indeed we could have a pretty wet summer at the end of the year. I mean, is that sort of what farmers are indicating to you, is maybe this predictions of a El Nino and we're back into drought maybe a little bit over-egged?
Oh, I don't think they're saying we're into drought. They're saying that we're on basically neutral.
Well, I think they're saying we're on a watch for El Nino now. They're certainly not watching for La Nina.
With a watch for it, but that could go either way at this stage. But I just think the reality is we've been at a lot of wet years, and so we're overdue a drought or overdue a drier period. But the reality is there's still a lot of subsoil moisture in large parts of the country. So even if it is a little bit drier than last year, it's still going to be decent conditions to growing an average or above average crop. And at this point in the year, it's way too early to see what it's going to be like.
Well, I guess the weather's a bit like markets, so a correction inevitably comes, even after a really good run. Hey, when it comes to genetically modified product, you've had a bit to say lately about where Indonesia's at on this. What relevance might that have for Australia?
Well, it's more of an interesting one, is that in the past, genetically modified wheat has been a sort of a no-go area. A lot of GM crops have been restricted more to products that are less direct to human consumption. Things like corn for biodiesel is a good example. But what we're seeing now is Argentina a couple of years ago approved a GM wheat variety with drought tolerance. And there was a bit of concern at the time. A lot of people thought, well, who's going to take that? But Brazil has accepted that, and they will take imports of Argentinian GM wheat. And in fact, Brazil has started approvals for the growing and cultivation of GM wheat in Brazil. And Indonesia this week also approved the imports of GM wheat for both human and animal consumption. And so that's a big thing, because Indonesia is, joint first, or forecast to be joint first in terms of wheat imports globally. So a huge customer and a huge customer of ours. And it's probably a sign that, food security has become a bigger issue around the world. And my view would be that Indonesia is probably looking at it as being a potential product which they don't want to say, well, we're not going to accept wheat from this country, because they need to ensure that supplies are fairly consistent. And maybe they're looking at it as a view of, more supply in the world will help alleviate prices. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It will be a debate, I think, in the coming years for Australian farmers, especially when the next drought comes, which there will be a drought at some point, whether it's this year, next year, the year after, there will be a drought. And I think that will get farmers really talking about whether they should have access to tools like drought-tolerant wheat. And the reality is, though, it will take a while for those approvals to come in Australia. Australia is very slow at approving novel GMOs, and so we shall see. But it's up to farmers to work out whether it's the right thing for them to have or not.
Well, certainly when we had a international or intergovernmental panel on climate change report come out this week, and we spoke with one of the co-authors of that from the university, the Australian National University, we talked about food security that you've just mentioned there, and if I can paraphrase what he was saying, that agriculture does get a bit of a leave pass in the ideology about climate change when it comes to reducing emissions. But he did say, nonetheless, farmers do need to reduce their emissions. And fertiliser, we've talked often about methane in this debate, but fertiliser application is one that we've seen in the Netherlands, for instance. Farmers have not only protested, but they've grabbed a fair chunk of the upper house vote because of concern about climate-driven changes on fertiliser. Where are the fertiliser prices now, and where's that market heading?
The fertiliser prices really follow gas prices, and gas prices have dropped from the recent highs, and that's flowed through to urea prices, which are finally falling in Australia. It's taken a bit of time for them to actually, international values to be reflected in Australia, but they are starting to come down. So anecdotally, we're hearing sort of the mid-600s for urea, and that's good. I would say one of the things of alleviating climate change from agriculture is increasing productivity. So whilst if you look at some analysis shows that more fertilizer use actually reduces the amount of carbon per kilogram of food produced. If you're producing more, then obviously the carbon impact or the emissions impact is lower. And that's why we want to aim for more productivity. Is probably the key way of actually reducing agriculture's footprint. If you look at, and we should be looking at, carbon or environmental footprints on a per kilo of food produced basis, not just, it produces X million tons of carbon or methane. Well, actually, we should be looking at, how much food is produced in that? And we should be looking at that as a metric, in my view. And we should be valuing agricultural emissions completely differently, in that producing 1 ton of emissions to produce a ton of meat or a ton of wheat is very different to producing a ton of emissions to produce some gadget or gizmo that is going to be thrown away in a year's time, some piece of plastic toy or something. So I think there's a, in my view, philosophically speaking, I think we should be looking at emissions on a value scale of how much useful that emission has been to society.
And that's on that method of carbon calculations, and a lot of these markets are still in their infancy, even though there's a sort of informal trade going on at the moment. But what are you picking up? Are people going around and selling carbon schemes or opportunities for farmers at the moment?
Yeah, so there is a big move. If part of the thing with these sort of carbon emissions trading schemes, or emissions trading schemes, if you want to call them, is that they require landholders to actually sequester carbon and then sell that carbon onto the market in order to allow big polluters like coal power stations, cement factories, those type of major heavy industries. If they want to continue, they've got to pay for carbon offsets to offset their emissions. However, we just believe that it's very important that farmers and landholders who are considering getting into carbon contracts are very careful about what they're signing up for. In many cases, and it's not always the case, these contracts are very long dated, so they could be 25 years plus. So we're talking generational contracts. What we want to make sure is that, farmers don't sell away too much, as an example. There's a lot of risks to them, but I'll use just one as an example that we see is very pertinent, is that let's say you sell your carbon over 25 years. At the moment, farmers don't have to account for their emissions. But what if they do? What if in 10, 15 years' time, the government changes their mind and says, now you've got to account for your emissions? And then all of a sudden, you've already sold all your carbon. So now you've got to buy it back in. So we've just got to be careful that we don't give away too much for a long period of time in a market that's still very much an immature and infantile market.
And speaking of markets, just to finish off, when it comes to, transparency, you're trying to get people to help you get a bit of transparency back on the fertiliser topic at episode3.net. What's the initiative there?
Look, we've just, over the last sort of 6 months or so, there's no fertiliser transparency in Australia. There's no access to local pricing. So we've just been asking farmers, a simple form on our website to fill in. It takes about 20 seconds just to tell us, where are you and what was your quote? That way we can actually start to say, well, here's how Australian prices compare to overseas markets. We can start to benchmark between states, and that's largely what we're trying to do, is just to try and shine a light on it, because those prices, unlike every other agricultural commodity market, it's just unavailable.
All right, well, that is at episode3.net online. You've been listening to Andrew Whitelaw, one of their analysts. Thanks so much for joining us again, Andrew. We'll catch you again soon.
No worries. Thanks, Ricky.